On one of the biggest days of my life, my graduation, my dad chose to sit in the bleachers at my stepbrother's soccer game instead of celebrating with me. I thought that was the end of it, but years later, he came back, asking for forgiveness. What happened next was something I never saw coming. Graduation day had been circled on my calendar for months. It was the culmination of years of hard work, staying up late to finish assignments, juggling shifts at the coffee shop, and sacrificing weekends to study. I'd envisioned this moment over and over, walking across the stage, hearing my name called, and seeing my parents' faces glowing with pride. Mom was there, sitting in the front row with a bouquet of roses clutched tightly in her hands. She waved enthusiastically when our eyes met, her smile wide and her eyes shimmering with emotion. My best friend, Megan, was further back, holding up her phone to take a million photos, shouting my name like a proud sibling. But the seat I'd saved for Dad? Still empty. I kept glancing toward the entrance of the auditorium, expecting to see him rushing in, maybe adjusting his tie or mouthing an apology for being late. But as more graduates walked across the stage, reality began to sink in. He wasn't coming. When my name was finally called, I plastered on a smile and walked across the stage, the cheers of Mom and Megan echoing faintly in my ears. I gripped my diploma tightly, holding back the tears that threatened to blur my vision. This was supposed to be a moment of pride, but all I felt was a hollow ache in my chest. After the ceremony, families gathered outside to take photos. Mom hugged me tightly, her voice trembling as she said, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." Megan handed me a card she'd drawn herself, complete with a little cartoon version of me in a cap and gown. But as much as their love meant to me, it couldn't fill the void left by Dad's absence. I checked my phone, hoping for a text or a voicemail explaining why he hadn't shown up. My stomach dropped when I saw his message. "Sorry, can't make it. Chris has an important game. I'll explain later." Chris, my 14-year-old stepbrother, had joined our family when Dad remarried a few years ago. He was talented at soccer, no doubt about that, and Dad had taken to his role as Chris's #1 fan with gusto. But this wasn't just any day. This was my day. And once again, Chris's soccer game had taken priority. As people around me celebrated, snapping photos and beaming with pride, I felt like an outsider. The sting of Dad's absence was sharper than I'd expected, cutting deeper with each passing moment. Mom must have sensed it because she held me close, whispering, "I know it hurts, but this doesn't take away from everything you've accomplished. You're amazing, and I'm so proud of you." Her words helped, but they couldn't completely erase the disappointment. Dad's absence wasn't just a missed event, it was a missed milestone. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't the first time I'd felt this way. It was just the first time I couldn't ignore it anymore. The car ride home felt like hours, even though the school was only 15 minutes away. Mom kept glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, her lips pressing into a thin line each time I sighed or stared out the window. She was trying to find the right words, but I didn't want to hear them. "He'll regret this," she said softly, her voice careful, like she was afraid I'd break if she said it too loud. "One day, he'll realize what he missed." I didn't respond. I wanted to believe her, but this wasn't the first time Dad had let me down. Birthdays he'd skipped for work, soccer games he'd missed for Chris's tournaments, school award ceremonies where he was a no-show because of last-minute plans. The list went on. But this time was different. It wasn't just another event. It was a milestone, the kind of moment you're supposed to remember for the rest of your life. And yet, he hadn't even tried to be there. When we got home, I went straight to my room, leaving Mom downstairs. I kicked off my shoes, letting them land wherever they wanted, and collapsed onto my bed. My cap and gown were still in the bag, untouched since I'd taken them off after the ceremony. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, hoping, stupidly, that it was Dad with some heartfelt explanation or apology. Instead, it was Megan, sending me photos she'd taken at graduation. "You looked amazing. So proud of you," the caption read. I smiled weakly at her enthusiasm, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. Scrolling through the pictures, I saw everyone else surrounded by family, parents with arms around their kids, siblings holding balloons, grandparents beaming with pride. And then there was me, smiling for the camera but standing a little too far from Mom, like I wasn't sure how to act. The anger came later, sharp and sudden, cutting through the disappointment like a knife. I grabbed my phone and texted Dad, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "You really couldn't skip one game for my graduation? What's wrong with you?" I stared at the message for a long moment, my heart pounding, before hitting send. An hour passed with no response. Then 2. By the time the clock hit 10, I realized he wasn't going to answer. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. His silence wasn't just an avoidance tactic, it was confirmation of what I'd been feeling all along. Chris would always come first. And no matter how much I tried to fight it, I'd always come second. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I wasn't going to beg for his attention anymore. If he couldn't be bothered to show up for me, then I wasn't going to waste my energy trying to make him. It wasn't about cutting him off or making a dramatic statement. It was about protecting myself. Because the more I kept hoping he'd change, the more I set myself up for disappointment. And I couldn't keep doing that anymore. It took Dad an entire week to call, and by the time my phone buzzed, I was already bracing for the worst. I didn't expect much. Maybe a half-hearted apology or some excuse about why he couldn't make it. But when I picked up and heard his voice, cheerful and oblivious, it was like he thought nothing had happened. "How's my graduate?" he said, his tone warm and casual, as if he expected me to thank him for the text message he'd sent during one of the most important moments of my life. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Really, Dad?" I snapped, my voice colder than I'd intended. "You skipped my graduation for a soccer game. Do you even realize how much that hurt me?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough to make me wonder if he'd hung up. Then finally he said, "Chris needed me. It was an important game." His tone was even, like he thought that explanation was good enough to erase the hurt he'd caused. "Chris always needs you," I shot back, the words spilling out before I could stop them.
"What about me?
Do I ever get to come first? Or is that just too much to ask?" His defensiveness kicked in almost immediately. "You're being dramatic," he said, his voice sharper now. "I've been there for plenty of things, and you know it. Don't act like I've never supported you." "Name one thing," I challenged, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. "Name one time you've shown up for me when it really mattered." He sighed, the sound heavy and impatient. "You don't understand the pressure Chris is under," he said. "This wasn't just any game, it was important for his future. And I thought you'd be fine. You're strong, your name. You didn't need me there to know how proud I am of you." His words only made the ache in my chest grow worse. "But I did need you, Dad," I said quietly, my voice breaking. "You weren't there, and you don't even seem to care." "I do care," he insisted. "But you're old enough to understand that sometimes sacrifices have to be made. I can't be in two places at once." I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "You didn't even try. That's what hurts the most. You chose Chris again, and you didn't even think about how that would make me feel." The line went silent for a few seconds. "Look," he said finally, his tone softer but still distant. "I'm sorry if you're upset, but I did what I thought was best. I'll make it up to you, okay?" I let out a bitter laugh. "You can't just make up missing my graduation, Dad. You missed it, and that's on you. I don't think you even understand what you've done." Before he could respond, I ended the call. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, my emotions swirling between anger, sadness, and exhaustion. That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Dad didn't really get it. To him, it was just another event he'd skipped, something he could smooth over with a half-hearted apology and a promise to do better next time. But to me, it was more than that. It was a reminder that I would always come second in his life. And for the first time, I wondered if I even wanted to keep fighting for a place in it. The weeks following my argument with Dad were heavy, but I forced myself to focus on the things I could control. My summer job at the bookstore became my escape, a place where I could lose myself in organizing shelves and chatting with customers. The steady rhythm of work kept my mind busy, and the paychecks helped me save for college, giving me a sense of independence I desperately needed. I also spent more time with my friends. Megan and I went on impromptu road trips, explored new coffee shops, and watched cheesy movies until we cried from laughing. Being around people who genuinely cared about me was a balm, even if the ache of Dad's absence lingered in the background. Still, there were moments when the hurt resurfaced. At the park, I'd see a dad teaching his daughter how to ride a bike, his laughter echoing across the playground. On social media, I'd scroll past posts of proud fathers standing next to their graduates, their arms wrapped tightly around them. Each time, the ache returned, sharp and unavoidable. I tried to push the feelings down, telling myself that I didn't need Dad's approval or his attention to feel complete. After all, I had Mom, Megan, and the friends who had shown up for me without question. That should have been enough. But late at night, when the world quieted down, the doubts crept in. Why wasn't I enough for him? Why did he find it so easy to prioritize Chris over me? I hated that I still cared, but the truth was I did. Dad made a few attempts to reach out in the months that followed. He sent me a text congratulating me on getting into my first choice college. "We should celebrate," he wrote, adding a smiling emoji that felt painfully out of place. A few weeks later, he called, inviting me to dinner. His tone was upbeat, as if he thought the invitation would erase everything that had happened. "It's been too long," he said. "Let's catch up." I ignored most of his attempts. The wounds were too fresh, and the thought of sitting across from him, pretending everything was fine, felt unbearable. Megan encouraged me to consider hearing him out, but even she didn't push too hard. "You're allowed to take your time," she said one evening as we sat on her porch, sipping iced tea. "He hurt you, and it's okay to protect yourself." Her words gave me some comfort, but they didn't answer the bigger question. Could I ever forgive him? Part of me wanted to. After all, he was still my dad, and a small part of me missed the connection we used to have. But another part of me wasn't sure I could trust him again, not after the way he'd let me down. As the summer stretched on, I poured my energy into preparing for college, packing up my childhood room and shopping for dorm essentials. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to focus on my future without the shadow of Dad's absence hanging over me. But no matter how far I tried to move forward, the past had a way of pulling me back. And deep down, I knew the chapter with Dad wasn't closed, not yet. By late summer, I was in full college prep mode. My room was a mess of boxes, checklists, and new dorm supplies. Mom had been my partner in crime, helping me pick out everything from bedding to a mini fridge. It felt good to focus on the future, to leave the weight of the past behind, even if it still lingered in the back of my mind. One Saturday, we headed to the mall for some last-minute shopping. As I browsed through a display of desk organizers, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Look at these, Dad," Chris said, holding up a shiny pair of soccer cleats. "Aren't they awesome?" I turned instinctively, my heart sinking when I saw them. Chris was beaming as he modeled the cleats, walking in exaggerated steps like a runway model. Dad trailed behind him, laughing and nodding in approval, a bag of other purchases already in hand. I froze, unsure whether to bolt or stay put. Before I could decide, Dad spotted me. His face lit up with surprise and something that almost looked like relief. "Hey, kiddo," he said, walking toward me with open arms. I forced a smile, shifting uncomfortably. "Hi, Dad. Chris." Chris gave me a polite wave, but didn't linger, already distracted by the next aisle of gear. Dad, however, stayed, his expression warm and casual, like he thought this was a chance to patch things up. "How's the college shopping going?" he asked, glancing at the items in my basket. "Need any help?" "No, I'm good," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Just finishing up some last-minute stuff." He nodded, his smile faltering slightly. "That's great. I'm proud of you, you know. Heading off to college, big step." "Thanks," I said, trying not to sound bitter. I didn't want to start another argument, especially not in the middle of the store. "Well," he said after a pause, "we should catch up soon. Dinner maybe? I'd like to hear about your plans." I nodded noncommittally. "Maybe." The interaction was brief, ending with an awkward hug before Dad rejoined Chris, who was now engrossed in picking out socks to match his new cleats. I watched them from a distance, the easy way they laughed and talked, and felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Dad's affection for Chris was obvious, his hand on Chris's shoulder, the way he laughed at every joke, the way he seemed so present. It wasn't that I resented Chris for having that connection. It was that I'd never felt like I had it myself. Later that evening, as I unpacked my shopping bags, the encounter replayed in my mind. Watching Dad and Chris together had stirred up emotions I thought I'd buried, hurt, jealousy, and a longing for something I wasn't sure I'd ever had. It hit me then. I hadn't moved on as much as I'd told myself I had. Seeing Dad so effortlessly engaged in Chris's life made me realize just how much I'd been holding on to. I wasn't just angry about graduation. I was angry about years of being put second. For the first time, I wondered if holding on to that anger was helping me, or if it was just keeping me stuck. But letting it go felt impossible. How do you forgive someone who doesn't seem to realize they've hurt you? A year had passed since graduation, and in that time, my life had changed in ways I never could have imagined. College had consumed most of my focus, with new friends, late-night study sessions, and the dizzying mix of independence and responsibility. I had carved out a routine, one that didn't include Dad. We still spoke occasionally, mostly surface-level conversations about school or family updates, but the emotional distance between us felt like an unspoken agreement. I wasn't ready to forgive, and he didn't seem ready to ask. That's why I was so surprised when, during one of his rare visits to campus, he suggested we grab coffee. I agreed out of politeness, expecting nothing more than the usual small talk. But halfway through our conversation, as I sipped my latte and listened to him recount Chris's latest soccer triumph, he suddenly leaned forward. "I messed up, didn't I?" he said, his voice quieter than usual. I blinked, caught completely off guard. "What are you talking about?" "Your graduation," he said, meeting my eyes for the first time since we sat down. "I should have been there. I don't know why I didn't realize it at the time, but I do now. And I'm sorry." His words hung in the air, heavy with a mix of sincerity and hesitation. It wasn't the apology I'd imagined during all those sleepless nights when I replayed his absence over and over in my head. It felt rushed, almost rehearsed, like he was ticking off a box on a list of things he needed to fix. "Why now?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why does it matter to you all of a sudden?" He sighed, stirring his coffee absently. "Because I've been thinking about it a lot. About you. About how much I've missed, how much I've taken for granted. I want to make things right. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be there for you from now on." I wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the relief of finally hearing the words I'd waited so long for. But part of me couldn't forget how easily he'd dismissed me before. "Do you even understand how much you hurt me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You didn't just miss a day, Dad. You missed a milestone. And the worst part is, you didn't even seem to care." He flinched, his expression softening. "I do care," he said earnestly. "I cared then, and I care now. I didn't realize how much it meant to you. I thought you were strong enough to handle it without me." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. "You don't get it, do you? I shouldn't have to be strong enough. You're my dad. You're supposed to be there, no matter what." He reached across the table, his hand resting awkwardly near mine. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "I failed you, and I'm sorry. I don't know if I'll ever deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try. I want to be better for you." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. His words felt genuine, but they also felt too late. Could I trust him to follow through? Or was this just another promise he'd failed to keep? "I'll think about it," I said finally, pulling my hand away. He nodded, his expression a mixture of hope and regret. "That's all I can ask." As we parted ways, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point, not just for him, but for me. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give easily, but maybe, just maybe, it was something worth considering. After our conversation at the cafe, something shifted in Dad. At first, I wasn't sure if it was just another phase, a short burst of guilt-driven effort that would fizzle out as soon as it started. But over the next few months, he proved me wrong, at least partially. He started showing up to family dinners, a habit he hadn't kept in years. At first, he sat awkwardly at the table, clearly unsure how to engage with me. But little by little, he began to ease back into our lives. He asked about my classes, my professors, and my plans for the summer. He even remembered to ask about my friends, something he'd never bothered with before. For a while, I kept my guard up. I couldn't help but wait for him to flake, to lose interest the way he always seemed to when things got hard. But as time passed, his efforts stayed consistent. He called regularly, sent texts to check in, and even started sharing parts of his life with me, things he used to keep to himself. One evening, during one of his visits, he brought up Chris. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "I think I made a mistake putting so much pressure on him." I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Chris loves soccer," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "But I think I pushed him too hard. I wanted him to succeed so badly that I lost sight of what really matters. I thought I was doing the right thing by being there for him all the time, but now I'm not so sure." His admission caught me off guard. For years, I'd resented the way he prioritized Chris, but hearing him acknowledge it, without me prompting him, felt like a step forward. Despite his efforts, the scars from the past weren't so easily erased. Even as we rebuilt our relationship, there were moments when I couldn't help but doubt his sincerity. Was he really committed to being a better father, or was this just a guilt-driven attempt to make himself feel better? I struggled with those questions constantly, especially during moments when old wounds resurfaced. Like the time he forgot to call on my birthday, only to remember 2 days later. He apologized profusely, blaming a work emergency, but it still stung. Or the time he mentioned Chris's soccer game during one of our conversations, and I had to remind myself not to roll my eyes. It wasn't that I wanted him to stop caring about Chris, it was that I wanted to believe he could care about both of us equally. One afternoon, after another strained dinner where we danced around the tension between us, Mom pulled me aside. "I think he's really trying, she said gently. "I know," I replied. "But sometimes it feels like it's not enough." She nodded, her expression sympathetic.
"It's okay to feel that way.
Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it does mean giving him a chance to prove himself." Her words stuck with me, and slowly, I started to let my walls down. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen all at once. But with every phone call, every dinner, and every small gesture that showed he was trying, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what we'd lost. Even so, a part of me wondered if I'd ever fully forgive him. The scars ran deep, and while time might dull the pain, I wasn't sure it could completely erase it. But for now, I was willing to try. And, for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The family barbecue was one of those rare gatherings where everyone seemed to be in good spirits. Mom had gone all out, making her famous potato salad and grilling up burgers, while Dad manned the grill, cracking jokes about his legendary cooking skills. Chris and his friends were tossing a soccer ball back and forth in the yard, their laughter blending with the sound of clinking plates and conversation. I mostly stuck to myself, chatting briefly with relatives and helping Mom in the kitchen. It wasn't that I didn't want to be there. It just felt easier to keep my distance. Even though things with Dad had improved, the wounds from graduation still lingered, and being around him in a casual setting made me feel a little off. At some point, Chris wandered over, kicking at the grass absent-mindedly. He was older now, taller, and a bit more confident, but there was still a boyish awkwardness about him that made me smile. "You know he regrets it, right?" he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I blinked, caught off guard. "Regrets what?" "Missing your graduation," he said, not meeting my eyes. "He doesn't talk about it much, but I can tell it eats at him. I don't think he knew how to fix it." I frowned, unsure how to respond. Chris wasn't the reason Dad had hurt me. I'd never blamed him for being the favorite, even if it sometimes felt like he was, but hearing his perspective surprised me. "How do you know?" I asked finally. Chris shrugged, kicking the ball lightly with his foot. "He gets this look whenever someone mentions it. Like he's embarrassed or something. And I've heard him tell his friends how proud he is of you. He just doesn't know how to say it to your face." His words hit harder than I expected. I'd spent so long resenting Dad for prioritizing Chris, for putting soccer games above my milestones, that I hadn't really stopped to consider his side of things. "Do you think he means it?" asked, my voice softer than before. Chris looked up at me, his expression serious. "Yeah, I do. He talks about you more than you realize. I think he just messed up and didn't know how to fix it." It was strange hearing this from Chris, the kid I'd once seen as the source of all my frustration with Dad. But now, I could see he wasn't some rival competing for attention. He was just a kid navigating his own relationship with Dad, trying to make sense of the cracks in our family dynamic. As Chris wandered back to his friends, I stayed rooted in place, his words replaying in my mind. Could Dad really be carrying that much guilt? And if he was, why hadn't he just said so? I realized then how much I'd assumed about Dad's feelings, or lack thereof. I'd convinced myself that he didn't care, that his absence on graduation day was a deliberate choice rather than a mistake born from bad priorities. Chris's words didn't erase the pain, but they did make me pause. Maybe Dad wasn't as indifferent as I'd thought. Maybe he was just human, flawed and uncertain, trying to navigate his mistakes in the only way he knew how. For the first time, I wondered if I'd been holding on to my anger as a shield, too afraid to let it go because forgiving him might mean letting my guard down again. And as much as I hated to admit it, part of me wasn't ready to let go of that shield, not yet. But Chris's words stayed with me long after the barbecue ended, planting a seed of doubt in the wall I'd built around my heart. And slowly, that wall began to crack. In the months after the barbecue, something shifted in me. Chris's words had planted a seed of doubt in my anger, and though I didn't fully understand it at the time, I started to see Dad in a slightly different light. He wasn't just the man who had hurt me, he was also someone carrying his own guilt, stumbling through his attempts to make things right. That didn't mean the hurt was gone. It still lingered in quiet moments, like when I scrolled past pictures of father-daughter dances on social media or overheard classmates talking about how their dads had helped them move into the dorms. But the bitterness that had once consumed me began to fade. I realized I wasn't letting go of my anger for Dad's sake. I was doing it for mine. Carrying that resentment felt like dragging a weight everywhere I went, and I was tired of feeling stuck. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting or excusing what had happened. It meant choosing to heal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, I found myself sitting on the porch with Dad. He had come over to help Mom with some repairs, and for the first time in a long time, the conversation between us was easy. We talked about my classes, my plans for the summer, even a new book I was reading. For once, it felt like he was fully present, listening to me without distraction or excuses. As the silence stretched between us, I took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say what had been on my mind for weeks. "Dad," I started, my voice steady but quiet. "I forgive you." He turned to me, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "But," I added, meeting his gaze, "it's going to take time to trust you again." He nodded slowly, his face serious. "I understand," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm serious this time." His words felt genuine, but I knew better than to take them at face value. Actions mattered more than promises, and I needed to see consistency before I could fully open my heart to him again. "Thank you," he added after a moment, his eyes glistening in the fading light, "for giving me the chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'll do my best not to let you down." We sat there for a while, watching the sun disappear behind the trees, the cool evening air settling around us. It wasn't a perfect moment. There was still a lot of pain to work through, and I wasn't sure where we'd end up. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope that our relationship might not be as broken as I thought. Letting go wasn't easy, and it didn't happen all at once. There were days when the old resentment crept back in, whispering that I was setting myself up for disappointment. But each time it did, I reminded myself that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, it was about freeing myself from its grip. As I worked to rebuild my relationship with Dad, I also began to rebuild my own sense of self-worth. I started to see that his absence on graduation day didn't define me or my accomplishments. It was his failure, not mine, and it didn't diminish everything I'd worked so hard to achieve. By letting go of the anger, I wasn't excusing him. I was choosing to move forward on my own terms. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Time has a funny way of softening sharp edges, and over the next year, my relationship with Dad settled into something resembling normalcy. It wasn't perfect. We still had our moments of tension, the unspoken weight of the past sometimes creeping into our conversations, but it was better. Dad showed up in ways he never had before. He came to visit me at college, not just for big events, but for smaller moments, too, grabbing lunch or sitting in on one of my student-run presentations. He even helped me assemble furniture for my off-campus apartment, grumbling about the instructions, but staying until every piece was in place. The effort was there, and I could see it. That didn't erase the hurt he'd caused, but it made me realize he was serious about rebuilding what we'd lost. One evening, during one of his visits, we went for a walk around campus. It was quiet, the paths lit by soft, golden streetlights. "I'm proud of you," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled. "For what?" "For everything," he said, his voice firm. "For sticking with school, for handling things on your own when I wasn't there, for giving me the chance to make this right." Hearing those words felt different now. A year ago, they would have rung hollow, but now they carried weight. He wasn't just saying them to smooth things over, he meant them. "Thanks, Dad," I said softly, and for the first time, I meant it too. As much as I appreciated his efforts, I knew our relationship would never go back to what it once was. The scars of the past were still there, and they always would be. But instead of letting them define us, I chose to see them as reminders of how far we'd come. Forgiveness hadn't been easy. It wasn't a single moment or conversation. It was a process, one I'd had to work through on my own terms. Letting go of the anger and resentment didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It meant choosing to heal, even when the pain lingered. I'd learned that relationships aren't about perfection. They're about effort, growth, and the willingness to try again, even when it's hard. Dad wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But we were trying, and that was enough. In the end, I realized that my self-worth didn't hinge on Dad's approval or presence. Graduation had been my moment, and while he hadn't been there, it didn't take away from everything I'd accomplished. Moving forward didn't mean erasing the past. It meant building something new, something stronger, on top of it. Our relationship isn't flawless, and it probably never will be. But we've found a way to meet in the middle, to acknowledge the hurt without letting it define us. And for the first time in a long time, I feel at peace. That, more than anything, feels like enough.